All right, well, it's good to be sitting down with you, Aidan, kind of after the weekend. You just had a baby, man. It's very exciting.
Literally, yesterday, Camden, who's 5, he just figured all on his own out of nowhere. He's like, there's more of us than you know. He's like, there's 3 of us, only 2 of you. Like,
that's fantastic.
Listen, kid.
That's awesome. You guys doing all right? Staying up all throughout the night and that fun stuff?
Dude, she's actually, so we have 3 kids. The boys were all colicky and crazy, and she's like a baby doll. I've heard her cry like for a collective minute. I'm like, this is amazing. But I'm on boy duty, so it's just like wrangling the hyenas like the whole time, so.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's
awesome.
As you had a kid, it made me think of childhood stuff. And so, do you have any like childhood? We talked about kind of promises, oaths, kind of looking at Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount this past week. Do you have any childhood like pinky promises you made that were memorable?
I do, but I'm curious if you have.
You okay?
I feel like you remember your childhood pretty good.
Not all the time, but the biggest one that I can think of was just on repeat all the time.
Yeah.
And so it was me and my brother. We'd play with Star Wars action figures. And most of the time it was either Christmas or his birthday, and he'd get a new one.
Nice.
He was really stoked about it. And he would look at me after we got all their lightsabers in their hands, blasters in their hands, ready to go for action and war. He would look at me right before we'd play and go, and now, Ethan, make sure you don't kill this guy off because he's my favorite and I just got him. And I'd be
he's
like,
gonna be the first to get him.
Yeah, as I trust him, I'm like, dude, you got nothing to worry about. A good older brother, I care about you. Yeah, I'd send all my troops after him and just knock him out.
Kill him.
But yeah, that's usually what we do.
I think of, not childhood as much. If I thought about it, I could think of probably some. When my wife and I were dating, we started dating, I was like 18, 19, she was 17.
Yeah.
And like, we hadn't really dated a lot of people, I don't know. But like there'd be like, oh, it's almost like what, by the best analogy for this passage. So many things, like if we were getting down to business, like if she was asking me a question or something, she'd be like, you pinky promise? And we both had this understanding that like, if we pinky promise, you were telling the truth, which is kind of silly. You're like, just tell the truth. But like, there's a lot of pinky promises. Like, you know, it's almost it's like a 19-year-old kid, the 17-year-old girl's like, you meet it? I'm like, oh gosh, man, that pinky just...
It's just dating advice right there.
Yeah, just whip out that pinky promise, get after it.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yep.
No doubt.
Hey, I have a question for you as we jump in.
Yeah. All right.
Who's running this ship? Ethan prints it all off. Very helpful. Very helpful. This is just a member. So I'm teaching on oaths. It's kind of a unique passage. Like, it's something we probably were like, don't kill. Don't lust. Don't, you know, and then you get to oaths, like, I don't know. We can't, like, how often have you read this passage, like, Lord, help me to not, you know? It's just something we skip over, but as going through it, there's so much, I think, on the ground practical. And so I was thinking about this. I'm like I'm at the bottom of the millennials, and then you're at the like top of Gen Z. So we're like, what'd you call it earlier?
Zillennial.
Zillennial.
Is the term I prefer the most.
So we both feel this, and then in our like just growing up relationships, like this idea of promise making or being what I say in the message, like flakiness, is just like really kind of easy for our culture to like. It's easy for us to like, yeah, I'll be there, I'll be there. Something cool comes along, we're like, I won't be able to be there. I'm tired. So you do something else, and it's real easy to do that kind of stuff. How do you see that show up? So you work with a lot of young adult, like you lead our young adult ministry. What would you say if you were talking to, we had young adults in here, and you were talking about, we should probably do this on Sunday, the importance of integrity with all that? Because we talked about consistency and how that's tied to integrity. It's a different word for integrity, basically. But how would you say, what is the value in being a person of integrity, of not being a flake? Like, what is the value in that? Because sometimes we can be like, I don't think it's that big a deal.
Yeah.
I told you I'd come to the cookout, and I can't. So I'm just going to do this instead. Like, what is the value of keeping that commitment, being consistent, showing integrity?
Well, all of what you're probably saying through sermon would be, like, direct you there. But I do think, like, slowly, like, I'm not going to the cookout or whatever it is, it slowly breaks down trust, for one. So you're like, one, I'm the person of integrity, I'm all of a sudden not becoming trustworthy. So it's moving that dial more and more in my life, shaping me into either a more trusting person or a more untrusting person. But I also think more than that, like when we were talking about this, I instantly think of like John 15. I don't know why, but like Jesus, he's inviting us to remain and to abide. And he keeps saying it. He's like, remain, 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 and then you'll produce fruit. And so I think it's interesting. He produces the fruit, but you're like I'll use this analogy. I've used it before with young adults at times, where we if our life is like a seed, what we do is we keep digging up the seed and then going and planting it somewhere else, and then digging it up again.
Gonna be my sermon on Sunday.
Yeah, we just keep going all over the place, and we never actually grow anywhere. Yeah. And so we go to the next soil that seems cool or whatever, but not actually grow. So I think like the value of integrity is being found. Like you're growing into a healthy person. Where you stay, you grow. Yeah. And where you go, you don't grow. Yeah. If you could say it like that.
And that I would say has implications for everything from my commitments to what I say. Like, is what I'm telling you true about me? Yeah. You know what I mean? And that, like, I think it just feels like such a quality of our culture where like terms like flake and FOMO, fear of missing out, like those things become common language because we're so used to like, and I'm sure there's relationships in your life. I know there's relationships in my life where it's kind of humbling to think I probably fill this role in people's lives of being like, they might be there. They said they would, but we'll see. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or like, it's just that notion.
Yeah. I do think about like you said we make soft no's and we just have little ways of edging and promises to our life, even if we don't use that word or pinky promise or whatever. People do that all the time, and I probably do that more than I'd like to admit. Yeah. But when you think about it, like when people make promises, maybe they don't use that word, maybe they do, and they break those promises. What should our response be as like followers of Christ?
Yeah, because a lot of some of these are formal promises, and some of them just saying we'll do something, we're not doing it. I mean, we're
not going to the cookout.
We're not aware that we made the promise. I think there's probably like varying like, so some people listening and like that promise that was broken was like, you said till death do us part. Yeah. And you ran off with a different guy, different girl. You know what I mean? Like there's like obviously promises that are like, this is painful. Yeah. And then there's like just disappointments, you know what I mean? Like, just let me down. And then there's just like annoying things. You know what I mean? Like, all right, well, you're late again. You know what I mean? Like there's probably varying. So I think there's what would set like this being practical advice from this being Jesus teaching us kingdom advice is Jesus also teaches forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7. So I think in all things, this is not easy and it's not our natural reflex is to be people of forgiveness. So when regardless of that level, when a promise is broken to us, I always think our first the first door we open is that of forgiveness. Now, I'm not saying that's easy, but I don't think there's ever a situation where forgiveness is not what Christ is calling us to. Yeah. So broken promise, forgiveness, yes. But I think with that, and people always have these questions when it gets dicey, is like almost applying wisdom to that. So to use like a stupid example, like if someone's going to come put a window in my house because I have a gaping hole in my house, I'm like, I'll be there Tuesday. All right, cool. And they're not there Tuesday. I'm like, I forgive you, but I'm going to need you to be there, the next, because I got a hole in my house, you know? And if that person doesn't show up again, you're like, I forgive you, but I'm going to call someone else. I think there's a wisdom to like trustworthiness with people. Like if someone is like, hey, I'll be there for you or whatever it may be, I want to extend forgiveness to them, but there may be a wisdom in, hey, I probably should not ask this of this person. I probably shouldn't put this expectation on this person. There's just a wisdom in that. You know what I mean? It's not to think of like a specific example, but like, I think there's, with like relationships, for example, like if you're dating somebody, think of the young adults again, like if you're dating somebody and like someone lets you down or there's a sin, like, there's a forgiveness there, but if you start to see like a pattern, you're like, you know what? This person's hiding things. This person, I keep catching them in things. Yeah. This is probably not wise for me to continue on this relationship. You know what I mean? Right. Or even in friendships, you know what I mean? Like, oh, this person's my friend. They just never show up. You're like, I forgive you. I don't want to hold that against that person because I'm going to be harboring bitterness. But I'm probably going to, like, seek new friends. So I think there's always, like, a forgiveness and wisdom kind of go together in how we respond to that. This would be what I would think of initially.
Yeah, I was thinking of, I was reading Proverbs 1 this morning, and literally in the beginning, of Proverbs, he says the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so something I think of, like people say all the time, I swear to, quote, I swear to God that I'm going to do this. And I just think how little we actually fear the Lord when we say that. Yeah. You're like, especially break it. Like,
yeah. And we almost feel like, what's interesting is we feel like, I swear to God.
Yeah.
We say it, like people say it.
With a weightiness, but not really.
But we also, you know how like, I don't know, like I grew up at church, like, oh my gosh, it's fine, but oh my God, I'm like, my mom's going to kill you, dude. Don't say it. You know, like, but there's something, I swear to God. But what Jesus is saying in this passage, he's like, you swear by heaven, by the earth, by Jerusalem for the city, or by your head. He's basically saying, like, we may not say, I swear to God, and feel good about not saying that. Sure. But when we make a promise, I promise you, we're swearing to God because it's his currency. And so whether it's the explicit, I swear to God, or I promise you, we're still invoking the same, like, truth, which I think is humbling when you start thinking about all the things that we are unintentionally untruthful about.
Yeah. So that's so helpful. When somebody breaks a promise to us, how in the world, like, let's say there is wisdom in, like, going, okay, maybe I'm not going to keep going into this relationship. But let's say there's been a little bit of a pattern, and I'm trying to figure out how do we build trust again in this thing. How do we go about rebuilding trust when promises have been broken to us, or maybe we've broken promises towards others?
Yeah. And all this, like, we're just dialogue. We're figuring out this together.
Sure.
There's so much of, like, guiding, like, almost like what are the rails on the side?
Yeah.
Because real life is so messy. You know what I mean? Like, all these, like, a promise isn't just, I'll be there at the cookout, you didn't show up. You know, there's always so much that's involved. But I think part of it begins with, like, the verbalizing, like, hey, just to let you know, like, I was really hurt that you told me to do that and you didn't. You know, I think sometimes we're scared to, like, and it depends on our personality too. Like, it's fine. They probably had something to do. And so we will bear the weight of that person's failure. Now, we're supposed to, as followers of Jesus, we're supposed to bear each other's burdens, but not in a healthy way. We'll do it like, I don't want to tell them, because we don't want to have a hard conversation or an honest conversation, so we just build up the resentment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so we're not actually bearing the burden. I think when we are failing to actually address maybe a conflict that we have with somebody, we're not bearing a burden. We are harboring, like, bitterness or resentment. And so I think, like, healing starts from, like, hey, I love you, but you weren't there. You know what I mean? And you probably didn't think much of it. And it doesn't need to be like sometimes we can over dramatize, like, sometimes there's things you're just like, all right, I'll ask someone else. You know what I mean? Like, hey, can you help me clean up whatever? Okay, well.
Yeah. I think, like, things we said, forgiveness always absorbs. So we always absorb something. And yet, Scripture all over, like, has warnings about a hard heart. And so when you absorb it into a heart that's healthy, it's like somehow healthiness eats that unhealthiness in some sense. Yeah. But if I don't have a soft heart, what it does is harden more and more and gets that bitterness in there. That's like just kind of a quiet resentment versus.
And on the other side, we were asking where that might be with someone else when we are the ones who break the promise. It almost like a necessary, and it sometimes depends on who it's coming from. I don't know. Like, we both, Dan is like our mentor. We both, you know what I mean, have, like, you know, worked on it. And there's times where we've dropped the ball. Yeah. More so you than me, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But there's those times where, like, or Adam too. You had Dan and Adam last week. But there's been times, like, I think of a certain situation where there was a promise deadline, it was work related, that I just, and Adam came in, I'm like, hey, he kind of shut the door. We had a hard conversation. And I felt like a fool. I'm like, come on. I dropped the ball. But in retrospect, I'm like, that made me better. You know what I mean? So sometimes, and again, appropriate relationships and stuff, but when I withhold having a loving, gracious, truthful conversation with someone, or when someone withholds that from me, we can be robbing that person of Christ working in them. Yeah. You know what I mean? So by, like, Dan coming to us to be like, hey, this situation, or Adam coming to me, it was like Christ forming things in me through that interaction. Like, how he doesn't form us by, like, here's magical dust to make you better. He forms us through, like, our failure and through real circumstances. And so I think that too, that, like, that there's something we rob ourselves when we don't engage with the the nitty gritty of working it out.
Yeah. I can think of a time where literally my lack of preparation, I just remember them having a hard conversation with me, sitting me down and going, that does not happen again. And I'm like, you're right. Like I felt the weight of it, but then all of a sudden in me, I'm like, I don't ever want this to happen again. Like,
exactly.
Like personally, I'm like, that shows my ill preparedness.
It's sometimes we're not aware of it. You're like,
yeah.
Oh, like, you know what I mean?
I was totally aware of it. They made me more aware of it, but yes.
More aware of how deep that ditch was.
I was aware of that. Absolutely. Let's talk about this. You mentioned this in sermon this past weekend, and how do we recognize when we're manipulating people? So with promises, I thought that was an interesting take on it. Like, we can manipulate people through promises. How does that happen? What does that look like a little bit more?
Yeah, I was reading, there's a guy named Dallas Willard who wrote a book, and he kind of goes through the Sermon on the Mountain there.
Yeah.
And in there, he talks about, there's a quote, I have a message from that, where he talks about, like, sometimes the heart of what we're doing is we're trying to manipulate people. And at first, you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. And as I thought about it, like, think about, like, my kid, like Camden, coming up, being like, Daddy, come play trains with me. And me being like, yep, I'll promise. I'll play with you in a minute. I promise. It's almost this, like, I want you to think I'm a good dad. We'll see if I actually play trains with you. But it's a way of me being like, I want you to think well of me, but to leave me alone for a minute. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or like I know it sounds harsh, but if you have kids, you do it too. But like, to get someone to think a certain thing about us. Yeah. Like, no, I promise. I think Sarah and I pinky promised them when we were 17 and 18 years old. Like, it's probably, you know, some dumb kid, but I'm like, but I want you to think that I'm really trustworthy. Now, that's a silly example, but it kind of, we use it to manipulate. And so I think that your question of how are we aware that we're doing that, I think there's almost maybe and we don't do this in the moment, but being like, what am I getting out of this by not just, when my son comes and he's like, will you play trains with me? Me being like, I cannot play trains with you right now in a little bit, and just telling him. Or can I play? Yeah, I can. What am I gaining by making the promise? What I'm gaining is him still thinking I'm a good dad, but me not actually having to do anything. You know, Sarah thinking I'm a good 17 to 18-year-old boyfriend, but me not actually having to, like, prove it. You know, I think that I know when I'm manipulating somebody, if I'm getting something out of the interaction without actually having to follow through with it in the middle, in the moment, maybe. Yeah. You know? Yeah. I'll probably have a better answer, I think, about it tomorrow.
I do think that promises is kind of a skirting way of not proving it. Just prove what you're saying. Like, say what you mean. I mean what you say. Kind of thing. Yeah. Absolutely. So we kind of addressed this at kind of the end of your sermon, but I wanted to double click on it. What would you say to somebody who feels like God hasn't kept his promises in their life? They feel hurt, betrayed, and forgotten. Like, God, where you at in all this, God?
I'd be curious what you read through my notes, and I just preached it. We recorded this Friday morning, recorded it earlier today, but what would you say to that question? Are there things that come to mind for you that, like, you get to work with young adults, and we both have conversations with a lot of people that are disenfranchised? What would you say to?
Yeah. Well, you're throwing on me pretty quick there. You know. I'm supposed to be asking the questions. I think this is probably because it's just recent, but Psalm 13 we kind of looked at as young adults on Sunday, and David's just praying, and he's like, how long, God? Are you going to forget about me forever? Where you at in all this? God, why haven't you shown up? And I think it's Isaiah, maybe 49, that Isaiah, he gives this prophecy of, like, I've never forgotten you. Like a baby to a mom, I've not forgotten you. So much so that my hands are engraved with your name on it. Like, God has our name tattooed on him, and he has scars to prove it too, like, backed up. So it's like like, just the reality of, like, he's not forgotten me. Even though maybe I feel like it, maybe I've forgotten him. Like, I think there's some of that where I'm like,
preaching.
I'm sorry. I'm just
Reverend Taylor.
I'm fleshing this out a little bit. I'm like, I wonder if maybe that's more it, that I got to reframe the question, where often I think it's easier to blame it on God, because then I don't have to. And I understand the hurt and depth, the frustration.
Oh, yeah,
and there's times
totally.
where God feels silent.
Totally.
He's felt silent in my life at times where you're like, yeah, that's real.
And sometimes I think when people feel like God has let them down, or God has disappointed them, broken promises, been disenfranchised, we hear this a lot in our culture, but sometimes it's the church and not God himself.
Yeah.
Which I think is off-putting for people, because I think people are like, well, what the heck? You guys are supposed to be people of God, and you're just as bad as the world, or just as unhelpful, or...
Yeah.
And I think that there's reality to that. But there's also... I'm always encouraged by... I'm like, man, how far off are we? And then you read books like 1 Corinthians or whatever, and you're like, all right, these dudes are... You know what I mean? It's always been a mess that's of people who've needed Jesus. And yeah, I think what you said with feeling like God broke our promises, or has broken his promises, I think it requires us to really take a look at, well, what did he promise?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? There's times where, like, Camden would be like, Daddy, you didn't da-da-da. I said, but I never said I was going to.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, you didn't help me build this. I'm like, I didn't tell. Like, every morning, so I get up early and do my stuff, and Camden keeps waking up early. He'll come down with me. And I'm like, you come down. We have a great time. But I'm like, Daddy's going to do his stuff. You build your trains. You play your game, whatever. But I'm going to read my stuff. I'm going to do this together. And he'll be like, why aren't you? I said, I told you when we came down. I'm going to read. No, I play with him. I'm not me. Sure. But I have to remind him, like, I didn't tell you that I was going to get up this early to play that with you.
Yeah.
But I want you to come be part of what I'm doing, you know? Yeah. And so I think there is something like, what does God promise? He promises in this life you'll have trouble. Yeah. You know what I mean? So if you got in trouble, you're like, this is the promise of the Lord is what this is. But I think there is something to sifting through what are the promises of God and what are the kind of cultural projections that maybe we as a church, whether us as pastors, have projected that, or have maybe gave a faulty interpretation of, that's like, oh, I thought you said that this was going to be, I have vision and passion and purpose. You're like, yeah, but it doesn't mean it's not at the cost of suffering and of wrestling. So I think it's looking at what does God actually promise us. You know, I think sometimes we want him to, we feel let down, but he's like, I never promised you that. Yeah. But like you said, that I think that's a deep promise, and you know this, you have kids. So we just added an arrow to the quiver here, so all these kid references. But if as a parent, like your kid goes through, you see lots of struggle, but like the promise is, I'm going to be here. And so I think whether it's loss, whether it's disappointment, whether it's a situation not panning out the way that we expected it to, it's almost maybe in those moments that we see the true promises of God, that our name is written on his hand, that he doesn't leave us or forsake us, that his word won't return void, that in this life you will have suffering, but I have overcome the world, that all those promises are yes, amen in Christ. Maybe sometimes it's suffering or, you know, rough situations that kind of sand off the flimsy Christian radio, flaky feelings of faith, and actually get down to the root of it.
Yeah, I think that's such a helpful distinguishing as the church and God. Sometimes we project our messiness as a church, or your whatever church background you come from, onto God himself.
Which us as a church need to take that and kind of take that to heart. You know what I mean? If oftentimes, well, the church just, it's easy to be like, well, you just don't get it. But be like, why do people feel that about the church? Yeah. Because there's probably valid things, but then there's also things that you're like, yeah, that's just us dropping the ball. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So let me maybe ask this, kind of wrap up our conversation, but should we just stop making promises altogether? like, should we just knock it off?
No more Well, it's funny because how people have been coming at the Sermon on the Mount for a couple thousand years, right? And there's traditions that, you know, certain traditions that are like, they don't. Not military, not going to swear anything under oath of law, don't take public service because of that. So there's that side. And then there's the side where it's like, it's kind of just an old, by oath, he means just that, so nothing else matters. I think we were kind of talking about this. There's certain, like marriage is an important promise, you know, but I think there's almost, it's worth asking the question, maybe, do we need to make promises? Like, do we just get rid of promises? Like, I mean, what is Jesus saying here? Is there something, if I do the work that Jesus is calling me to, if I just, on one hand, don't make promises I can't keep. So, hey, Ethan, will you help me with this? I can't. Yeah. Just being clear and concise with that, and knowing when to say no, knowing when because we want to know, I can, and then we're not going to be able to. What is a promise accomplishing that my yes or no isn't accomplishing? You You know what I mean? Because James says exactly what Jesus says again in James. Is like, keep it simple. Yes be yes and no be no. So we keep making promises. What is the promise accomplishing? And maybe there's, as we go through the weekend, there might be stuff to wrestle through. But what is a yes or no? What is the promise accomplishing that a yes or no can't? So
it's good.
Yeah, you're gonna get married, put a ring on it. Like, yeah, so those things are important. Yeah. Before the Lord. But in our day to day with our children, to our spouse, I promise I'll never again. What if instead of promising I'll never do that sin again, you just get some accountability, have some community in your life, and do it. We're not gonna be perfect. You know what I mean? So I always gotta look to Jesus, but I don't know if the promise is accomplishing what my actual life could accomplish.
Yeah.
I think something like that.
What a helpful way to just break down a passage where you're like oaths, and we think maybe that's so archaic or not what we do, and you're like, oh man,
it's every day.
How often? Do I just make false little promises and ways to try and control whatever? But hopefully this conversation has been helpful for some.
Where's Dan and Adam? Get them back on the horn here.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for chatting to us, man.
Absolutely. Until next time.